Good day. My name is Krasен Stančev. I teach macroeconomic analysis, public choice theory, political risk analysis, and public sector economics for economists and non-economists. I'm your host for the Sofia Conversations, which is part of the conversation series of the European Values and Social Challenges, a framework summit project. My pleasure and honor is today to welcome Professor Popovski after perhaps more than 30 years of friendship and more than 20 years of joint work. Professor Popovski is a Vice Dean of the Jingao Global Law School in India and the Executive Director of the Center for the Study of the United Nations. Behind his academic career, he has also a diplomatic career, and we've met actually when you were Secretary of the Bulgarian Embassy in London at the beginning of the 90s. You have a doctoral degree from the King's College London, and he has been teaching at Exeter University in the United Kingdom. After some diplomatic career, you ended up at the UN University in Tokyo and still teach there, as far as I remember. At the Jingao Law School, you teach human rights law, international criminal law, and international public law.
Yes.
I would like to discuss with you the current challenges for the global security order. In the view of the war of Russia against Ukraine and the war of Hamas against Israel. And I would like to pick up from one of your 20 books, which was remarkably interesting, published about 14 years ago. And the title of the book was Norms of War in a Cross-Regional Perspective. So let me start with the following question. What is so peculiar about the war of Russia against Ukraine? How it compares to the many wars of the 20th century, especially the most aggressive one, the Second World War?
Thank you, Krasен, and thank you to the project for the invitation to be a speaker today. Indeed, we can look at the Russian aggression against Ukraine as a blatant violation of international law, of the world order created in 1945 with the establishment of the United Nations Organization and its charter, which was the first document, international document, that prohibited the use of force in international relations. And
wasn't that the case with the League of Nations before that?
The League of Nations did not prohibit the war. There was a pact between Bryan and Kellogg in 1928 between France and United States. The two foreign secretaries wrote a pact, which many states later also joined, but it was not a universal prohibition of the war. Before that, before 1928, one country could simply declare a war and send the army to invade another country. That was not prohibited explicitly in international law, although many, obviously, pacifists back in the history of the humanity will speak about the prohibition of war. You mentioned the book, exactly. The main religions are generally considered to be pacifist. Most of the text of the Quran, of the Bible, of the Veda, of the other texts are pacifist. And the only exceptions of that pacifism is...
They're very human.
Exactly.
And
the only exception of the pacifism is the idea of self-defense, which in Islam will be the jihad, and in other traditions also, the only permission to use force will be in self-defense. And back to today, we can see that the aggression, the crime of aggression committed by Russian Federation against Ukraine go against all the principles, not only of the UN Charter, but also
let us
of
be more
previous
specific.
prohibitions.
So you have 1938, you have annexation of the Sudetenland, and you have the Anschluss of Austria. how it is different from 2014 annexation of Crimea?
In several aspects, it's different. One is that there was an agreement in 1994 for Ukraine to disarm. And one of the guarantees was the Russian Federation, in addition to the other permanent members of the Security Council. And also another difference is that Nazi Germany never violated, because it was not part of the League of Nations at the time, in 1938. Actually, Hitler left the League of Nations before invading Czechoslovakia and Poland. So Germany technically was not a member of the League of Nations.
This means that before 1938, before the annexation and the Anschluss, Germany actually left the League of Nations.
League of Nations,
so
exactly.
She was not responsible, for the actions.
Well, technically, legally speaking.
Legally speaking,
not a violation of the crime of
there was a Munich agreement,
yes,
which basically allowed for the annexation of the Sudetenland, no?
Yes, it was.
So there was no such agreement for the annexation of Crimea.
I regard the Munich agreement as somehow the result of this pacifism, this idea that historically you give a last chance to peace. So when
Perhaps
Chamberlain came back from Munich, he was
was
basically saying this is the peace of all times. He was so proud of signing Munich Agreement in 1938 that he reported back to the British Parliament, the British people, that he achieved the peace of all time. Only that to break immediately after.
So the Anschluss was preceded by some sort of a referendum in Austria, which basically...
And you already sense the similarities between the Crimea referendum and the Anschluss, and between the language in 1938 of Hitler and Göring, speaking about German minorities suffering under the Czechoslovak government. Similar language uses Vladimir Putin to say that Russian population in Ukraine suffer from
Eastern
the government.
Ukraine and Crimea.
Linguistic rights, human rights violation. So exactly with the language back in 1938, which used Goebbels and Göring and others to justify the invasion to Czechoslovakia.
But there are more unique features of the last year aggression of Russia. So, of course, you've mentioned the League of Nations story by Germany exiting it. You've mentioned the Budapest Agreement of 1994. But what's the situation vis-a-vis the membership of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, or the Soviet Union?
What is another peculiar
in the United
development is that Belarus and Ukraine are original members of the United Nations, together with the Soviet Union. It was agreement by Stalin to give Ukraine and Belarus because of their contribution to the Second World War, to the defeat of Nazi Germany. They were given this special status of separate membership, which is not the case with the Russian Federation. So kind of the paradox here is Ukraine is an original member of the United Nations. Russian Federation is not, because at the time it was the Soviet Union.
Legalistically speaking, yeah.
Now, yes, that argument is made by the Ukrainian delegation in New York to revisit the membership, although I am not supporting Ukraine on that, because the agreement in 1991 was voluntary. Ukraine, Belarus, but all other republics of the Soviet Union decided in a consensus to provide Russia Federation with the membership in the Security Council and to remain in possession of the nuclear weapons.
For the general
public. Let me finish.
Yeah.
The return of that is the security guarantee. So what Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and all other countries did in 1991 was saying, yes, we are no longer Soviet Union. We can be separate members of the General Assembly, and the Russia Federation will be the continuous permanent member of the Security Council. They also disarm, as we talk about. All the nuclear weapons were moved out of Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan to the Russian Federation. And in return to that, Russian Federation, together with United States and other big powers, guarantee the security of Ukraine. And that's why the aggression is so blatant. It's almost like, a family decide a sick person to go to hospital because the protection is given to someone else more competent and more capacitated to take care of the sick person. and the doctor in the hospital, instead of taking care of the patient, because the family already delivered that patient, the doctor decided to kill that patient. This is exactly what Russia does, disarming the neighbors to provide a guarantee for their security, and then to attack Ukraine.
I can give you lots of details about disarmament of Ukraine. It was actually decided by the Ukrainian Soviet Republic in April 1999. There was a declaration of Verkhovna Rada of the desire to be independent, sovereign state at the expense of disarming itself and demilitarizing itself, thus giving up the army. So that was the security believed by the socialist Ukraine to be given to the entire world and, of course, Soviet Union, because they wouldn't have an army, so they would be a peaceful neighbor.
So you see a situation where the guardians of peace, and that was the language in 1945, the 5 victors of the Second World War, Soviet Union, United States, Britain, France, and China, were given the special status in the United Nations to be able to adopt decisions that are absolutely mandatory for the entire world, in fact, to undertake use of force. So that you have a principle of non-use of force, which you just talked about, but the decision of the Security Council overruled that principle. It overrules also the old principle of non-intervention in domestic jurisdictions.
So,
and the Security
let's be more specific.
Council,
as a member of the Security Council, the Russian Federation has some obligations.
Exactly.
Could you name them?
Well, to maintain and restore international peace and security, and for that matter, to adopt measures under Chapter 7, such as sanctions and use of force, to resolve threats to international peace and security. Almost ad verbatim quote from the UN Charter. So instead of doing that to protect international peace and security, and it's not the first time, by the way, Russia vetoed 11 or 12 times resolutions to address the Syrian conflict in the last 11 years. Almost 13 million Syrians left Syria, and another 250,000 Syrians die in a civil war in Syria. And effectively, Russia protected the government of Bashar al-Assad, which used chemical weapons and other violations of international law, bombing Aleppo. And by the way, we're talking about Gaza today. Remember Aleppo. In Aleppo, more civilians die for absolutely unnecessary action. So if you compare Aleppo and Gaza today, we will talk about Gaza later, but Aleppo was much more murderous, 3 times more murderous against the civilian population of Syria than Gaza today. And all those actions, all those war crimes committed by Syrian government remain protected by the Russian veto. No investigation was possible by the United Nations, by the International Criminal Court, including on the use of chemical weapons. So the veto itself
is there a similar
turned from, let me finish this. The veto regarded in 1945 as an element of protection. Basically what the countries in 1945 were saying is that we give those 5 victors of the Second World War the power to maintain peace, and we hope they act in unity to do that. And we expect them, and I understand that feeling back in those days. Somehow the small countries were believing those 5 will remain together because they just defeated the Nazi Germany and the Japanese military. And the expectation was they will do the work. However, back in 1945, there was a suspicion about the veto, and this is where we come to Article 109 of the UN Charter. Small countries, like New Zealand, Poland, all the Latin American countries, Australia, decided to include the Article 109 to revise the Charter within 10 years of the existence. So basically they said, okay, you go ahead, you are the powerful today, but we want to revise the Charter and to remove the veto once the enemy state status of Nazi Germany and Japan is no longer there. So we have delegations such as Australia, New Zealand, Uruguay drafting Article 109 suggesting that the veto will not stay for too long. It's just to start. Moreover, they wrote that in 1955, if not before that, in 1955, there will be a review conference of the UN Charter convened by a simple majority. At that time, there were 50 plus countries, so 8 countries could have convened a review conference in 1955 and eliminate the veto.
We will come to the possible changes to the UN Charter and the Constitution of the International Security, the so-called World Order. But finishing with the Russian Federation, is it a correct summary to say that instead of fulfilling its obligations of preventing any war in the world, Russia has done just the opposite?
Exactly. And by the way, these were the grandparents of those people in Kremlin today. Their grandparents died in the Second World War to live in peace. So that's so paradoxical. Effectively, today, Russian leadership is doing exactly the opposite of their own grandparents, sacrificing the Second World War, never again, no more aggression.
Not to mention that part of that war was instigated by the Hitler-Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and Russia was excluded, as far as I remember, from the League of Nations because of its aggression and invasion of Finland in 1940.
Yes.
Okay, so is there any similar peculiarity of other wars, and especially you've mentioned already comparing, Aleppo with, I don't know how to use it. Is it a crisis or it's a conflict in Gaza or it's internal hostility, so to say?
Well, it's a very long, prolonged conflict,
75 years now.
From 1948, exactly. Again, we don't have time to go into much detail there, but effectively, again, if you want similarities here, you can say that it very much reminds, for Israel, this is yet another action of terrorism against Israel, against civilian people. So what Hamas did on 7th of October was very similar to the 9/11 attack on the United States. For me, the important thing here is back to what we started the discussion, the self-defense, what is traditionally regarded as a jus ad bellum, as a right to fight. Israel definitely has that. And obviously here we can say that nobody can deny that right to self-defense to Israel. And it's absolutely clear. But what you see, if you want to discuss again the United Nations Security Council, here we have the opposite situation. United States is vetoing a resolution which otherwise was very much in agreed, drafted by Brazil. Most of the other countries were happy with it. 12 out of the 15 were happy with that. Using the same veto power, which we were talking about on the behalf of the Russian Federation, here the United States, and again, not only now, United States used to veto resolutions on Israel and the Middle East conflict for all decades, for 55 years. And doing that, again, brings us to the point, do we really need an organization where the big powers will veto resolutions and do nothing in situations where they may randomly decide this is matching their national interests?
But the difference between the United States and the Russian Federation or Soviet Union in 1940, United States is not a country which annexes anybody's territory, no?
True. No, I'm not comparing that. I'm saying that the right of veto can be abused by any of the five, and they did it in the past. So my proposal here comes to not, again, most of the conversation about reforming the United Nations is to add additional members, to bring Japan, India, Brazil, South Africa, and to Germany, and to make a bigger Security Council and with more permanent members.
And perhaps
I'm totally against that. Again, and I'm speaking in India and Japan to many people, and I say, how do you want to see a problem going bigger by more permanent? The problem is the permanent membership. The problem is the veto. You cannot go there because the rest of the world will be not happy to increase that membership. You need to do exactly the opposite. You need to eliminate the veto, and even more radically, to have an organization without permanent members. let the America and China and the big powers be members for 8 or 16 or 24 years, but not permanently without
Okay.
it.
Our public doesn't know that Professor Popovski was part of the team to redraft the UN Charter. There was a process of public discussion, and the amended charter, or the draft amendment to the charter, was available for public signatures, and there are about 12 colleagues from Sophia University which signed, what you have written.
Thank you, by the way, for that.
But let me go back to the roots of the conflict between, or the terrorist act of Hamas against Israel. So it is clear that the United Nations constellation in the Security Council can lead to opposition between such countries like United States and Soviet Union, then Russia. But there is a difference, obviously. To the extent I understand, I don't know the details of each and every veto of the United States, but as far as I remember, their common denominator is this is a protection of Israel as a sovereign state which was established by an international agreement.
Yes, absolutely.
So who is responsible for sustaining the conflict between Arab countries and the Palestinian organizations like BDS, the Organization for the Liberation of Palestine?
Yes.
Or
Okay, if
Hamas
you want
or
me to answer
Hezbollah?
that, I will go like this. The original mistake done by the Arab countries back in 1948 was not to create the state of Palestine. They were given that chance. They could have had 60% of the territories. 46-54 was the division of the territory of Palestine. But at that time, the Arab countries took the other position. Israel has no right to exist. This is Palestinian land. This is Arab land. Who are those Jews who want to have a state here?
And it was in 48.
Yes. So they start fighting Israel immediately after Israel created its statehood. And that was, I think, the biggest initial original sin of the Arab countries, because this is, and also because of they lost that war, and a lot of Palestinian innocent population had to leave, and they moved as refugees for so long, for 75 years. At no point, the Arab countries did not accept those Palestinians.
So what
And
you're saying,
they let the Palestinians in
let me repeat.
refugee
You're
camps.
You're saying that the refugees of internal Israeli-Palestine conflicts were never accepted by the neighboring Arab Muslim countries.
Exactly.
Really?
They were left in refugee camps, part of Jordan, part of Egypt, but in refugee camps, not integrated in the schools, in the cities with jobs and all other opportunities.
Were they, meaning
they were
Arab,
left as refugees to return back to Palestine.
were they neighboring Arab countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran?
Well, these are not neighboring.
They're not
to Israel.
neighboring. That's why I'm adding them, to the list. Were they undertaking any, for these 75 years, any measures to make the life of Palestinians in Israel softer?
Not really. Exactly the opposite.
Exactly
They
the
made the
opposite.
life more miserable because they tell the Palestinians, go and destroy Israel. This is your land, you have to take it back.
And they were
And
financing and
Exactly.
supporting
And this
them
is
militarily.
over time what happened in 1967, in 1973. The Arab countries started those wars. And over time, we see actually gradual realization on part of some of the Arab countries, mostly Egypt and Jordan were the first, to create a dialogue with Israel to effectively establish diplomatic relationship with Israel. And over time, more countries, and now we come to 2023. Saudi Arabia wanted to do the same, to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. And that was seen by Iran as a big change in the equation in the Middle East. So if you want an instigation of what Hamas did, is probably Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas.
Was it possible to organize this terrorist act with the forces and finances channeled to Hamas without logistical support from satellite technology?
Yes, I think I read that, and it's probably possible that Russian Federation, Iran, I'm not sure about China, supported Hamas with intelligence.
I tried to look at the positioning of global positioning of the satellites. You know, U.S., Israeli, British, and Russian satellites in that region. You know, hanging above the region.
Yes,
You know, it's,
most possibly, yes.
Okay.
Because for Russia, this war is very useful exactly to distract the attention.
Building on your experience, including as a drafter of the amended Constitution of the United Nations, what is the prospects for a sustainable world order that protects peace? Can the world enjoy another 60 years of peace?
Okay, let me now get a bit more positive.
If we take the period after the Caribbean
Usually
crisis.
it does. Again, in the worst of the times, we have establishment of the United Nations happened when the world was destroyed by the Second World War. The League of Nations happened exactly after the First World War, which the world was. So in time of disasters, usually those ideas come, what to do next? And here comes really the time to what my last book is, reimagining international order. And I start by refusing to accept suggestions of more permanent members of the Security Council because it adds into the problem rather than removes the problem. What we argue in that group you mentioned, our project on rewriting the United Nations Charter, suggests
you were
no
invited by the
permanent
General
membership.
Secretary, no?
Yes, no permanent membership and no veto as an arrangement. And obviously, big powers such as Japan, United States, China, they can also have long membership. They can be there for 25 years, for one generation, contribute everything they want to contribute to international peace and security. But no permanent members, no veto, new constitution, as you said, which will inherit from the current United Nations everything else which the UN did pretty much well. Things such as vaccinations, humanitarian disasters, mobilization of efforts to support refugees, protection over those times. So we can have a long list of successes of the United Nations, but they don't go into the most important primary role of international peace and
I read
security.
the draft, but for our audience, does the new draft, new constitution of the UN envisages expulsion from the Security Council or any other structure of nations which countries which commit an aggression?
Yes, it does. Exactly. It existed in the League of Nations. It was dropped by the current UN Charter, although there is a suspension from the General Assembly for countries who do not pay the financial contribution of it. So there is only one option to stop a membership, and only in the General Assembly. Now, actually, when you don't have a permanent membership, you don't need to exclude anybody, because the next time there is a renewal of the membership, you don't need to elect the same country. So that solves also that problem.
Yeah,
a country that commits aggression.
If you expel someone, you cannot talk to him or her. You know,
exactly.
That's
part of the sanctions, in fact, include diplomatic sanctions. And I'm curious why those were not, even with the current model, you can have diplomatic sanctions against the country. You can reduce the ambassador level to chargé d'affaires. You can use all the other options there too. You know, I'm not advocate of expelling members from the United Nations. I want United Nations to be fully inclusive. I'm not saying that even North Korea should be expelled from the human rights. Often, you know, you see Human Rights Council have countries such as Syria, Libya, and North Korea. For me, that's not a problem. In fact, they should be there to listen what the discussions are about the human rights. And in a way, United Nations should be all-inclusive, but with the options to introduce sanctions. So if a future Russian Federation, maybe a different country, commit the same crime of aggression, the Security Council, without the veto, should adopt economic, diplomatic, and all
Can
other
the General
sanctions.
Assembly exclude Russia from the Security Council now?
It can. It
Okay.
can.
Last question.
Okay.
This is the second part of my previous question. Is it there any likelihood that the world will enjoy another 60 years of peace?
Well, if things that we talk about happen, if we have United Nations in Gaza and in Donbass taking care of for 5 years of the administration like they did in Cambodia, like they did in Timor-Leste, like they did in Kosovo, if United Nations takes care of Gaza and Donbass and pacify those two places, and then it goes into referendum and other democratic arrangements there, that's how I see this solved. You cannot expect Israel and Hamas to run Gaza. You need United Nations in Gaza for 5 years in a transitional authority, doing all the work, including taxation,
Do you think that's
economy,
the case
reconstruction,
do you
justice.
think that the case with Eastern Ukraine and Crimea is similar to that?
I don't see any problem.
Great many thanks to Veselin Popovski. I believe that this conversation of ours will be a really global conversation, and many others will follow our steps and discuss similar issues about the eternal peace if we go back to Immanuel Kant.
Thank you.
Actually, the ideas of Immanuel Kant, were very much in line with what you were talking today.
Talking about European values and social challenges, context.
Actually, people don't know, but the European values had a long way to come from. And they come from the Bible, they come from the Quran, as you started. They come from the reforms in 1839 in the Ottoman Empire, in 1848 in Europe, and then after the Crimean War. The human rights perspective and human dignity perspective, the right to just judicial process and that sort of stuff, were extended to Crimea, Bessarabia, and southern Ukraine.
Absolutely.
It was in 1856. So the tradition is there. We have to keep it. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Krasen. Thank you, everyone.